The town of Redemption Creek had never seen a proposal quite like the one that unfolded on that blistering July afternoon, when the dust hung thick in the air and every soul on Main Street had gathered, drawn by rumor and curiosity, to witness something that would be talked about in saloons and church pews alike for years to come. Isabel Cross stood in the middle of the dirt road in a gown the color of dried blood, deep red and richly embroidered, a gown that cost more than most men in that town earned in half a year, and she looked across the small stretch of dust between herself and the man she had summoned there with a directness that scandalized even the most progressive-minded women of the territory. She was, by any measure, the wealthiest woman west of the Mississippi that anyone in Redemption Creek had ever laid eyes on, the widow of a railroad baron who had left her not only his fortune but also controlling interest in 3 separate mining operations, a cattle ranch spanning more acres than the eye could comfortably measure, and a reputation so formidable that men twice her strength crossed the street rather than risk her sharp tongue and sharper business sense. She was also, and this detail mattered a great deal to the gossiping townsfolk, a mother, raising her young son Thomas alone since her husband's death 2 years prior in a train accident that had made headlines from Chicago to San Francisco. Jack Calloway had ridden into Redemption Creek only 3 months before, a drifter by every outward appearance, with calloused hands and a quiet manner that suggested a man who had done hard things and paid hard prices for them, though he spoke little of his past and the town, in its way, had learned not to ask. He had taken up work at the livery stable, mending fences and breaking horses with a gentleness that seemed at odds with the guarded wariness in his eyes, and had kept largely to himself except for the occasional evening spent at the saloon nursing a single whiskey while he watched the room the way a man watches for trouble he has learned, through hard experience, to expect. It was young Thomas, in fact, who had first taken a shine to him, following him around the livery with a persistent devotion small boys reserve for men who do not treat them as nuisances, and it was through Thomas that Isabel Cross had first taken notice of the quiet drifter, watching from her carriage window as her son laughed freely for the first time since his father's death while Jack showed him how to properly saddle a pony. What passed between Isabel and Jack in the weeks that followed was known to almost no one, conducted as it was in the careful, guarded way that 2 people circle each other when both have been burned badly enough by life to distrust anything that feels too easy. But something had passed between them, some current of understanding that the town could sense even if it could not name it, and so when Isabel Cross rode into the center of Redemption Creek that July afternoon in her finest gown, flanked by her household staff and half her ranch hands, and called out across the street for Jack Calloway to come speak with her, the entire town had abandoned their business to watch. "Jack Calloway," she said, her voice carrying clear and steady across the dusty road, pitched loud enough that there could be no mistaking her intention to be heard by every ear present. "I have given this considerable thought, and I will not waste further time pretending otherwise. Be my husband." A silence fell over Main Street thick enough to taste, the kind of silence that follows a gunshot before anyone has quite registered what they heard. Men who had been leaning against porch rails straightened. Women who had been sweeping their stoops froze mid-motion, brooms suspended in the golden afternoon light. Even the horses tied along the hitching posts seemed to still, as though sensing that history was being made in the dust between them. Jack Calloway did not answer immediately. He stood there in his worn vest and dusty trousers, his hat casting a shadow over eyes that had gone carefully unreadable, and for a long moment it seemed as though the whole town held its breath waiting on him, this drifter with no name worth speaking of, no fortune, no claim to anything beyond the horse he rode in on and the calluses on his hands. "Mrs. Cross," he said finally, and his voice, though quiet, carried in the stillness. "You don't know what you're asking." "I know precisely what I am asking," Isabel replied, and there was steel beneath the composure of her words, the steel of a woman who had buried a husband and built an empire in the aftermath and had long since stopped waiting for the world's permission to want what she wanted. "I am asking a man who has shown my son more kindness in 3 months than most men manage in a lifetime to make that kindness permanent. I am asking a man whose past is none of this town's business, and none of mine either, unless he chooses to make it so, to stand beside me not for my fortune, which I suspect he cares nothing for, but because I have watched him closely enough to know the measure of him, and I find that measure sufficient." The crowd murmured, a low ripple of astonishment moving through the gathered onlookers like wind through wheat. For it was one thing to hear rumors of the wealthy widow's interest in the drifter, and quite another to witness her stake her reputation so openly, so completely, in the full light of a summer afternoon with half the town as witness. Jack's jaw tightened, and for a moment something flickered behind his eyes. Not hesitation exactly, but the particular calculation of a man weighing a truth he had been avoiding against a moment that would not wait for him to finish avoiding it. Then he did something that shocked the entire gathered crowd of Redemption Creek far more than the proposal itself had. He reached up and removed his hat, holding it against his chest, and in a voice pitched to carry as clearly as Isabel's had, he said, "Before I answer you, ma'am, there's something the whole town best hear, since you've made this a public matter, and I won't build a marriage on a foundation you don't fully understand." The crowd, if possible, grew even more still. Isabel's chin lifted slightly, a flicker of uncertainty crossing her composed features for the first time since she'd ridden into town that afternoon, though she did not retreat a single step. "My name," Jack said, "isn't Calloway. Not by birth, anyway. I was born Jonathan Weatherby, son of Elias Weatherby, who you might know by reputation, Mrs. Cross, seeing as your late husband did business with him on more than one occasion before things between our families went the way they did." A gasp rippled through several of the older townsfolk, those who had lived in the territory long enough to remember the name. Elias Weatherby, a rancher whose empire had once rivaled any in the region before a bitter dispute over water rights and a railroad spur line had ended in violence, in burned barns and dead cattle and, eventually, in Elias Weatherby's own death at the hands of hired guns working, as the story went, for interests connected to the very railroad that had made Isabel's late husband his fortune. Jonathan Weatherby, the rumor had held for years, had vanished after his father's death. Some said dead himself, others said fled west in shame or grief or both, and no one in Redemption Creek had ever thought to connect that old, half-forgotten tragedy to the quiet drifter mending fences at the livery stable. "I changed my name because I wasn't fool enough to think folks would look kindly on the son of a man labeled a troublemaker and a thief in every newspaper east of the Rockies, whether or not the truth of it was ever half so simple," Jack continued, his voice steady despite the weight of what he was confessing. "I came to this territory looking for honest work and nothing more, Mrs. Cross, and when I took a liking to your boy, and later to you, I told myself the past didn't need airing, since it was buried with my father and had nothing to do with the man I'd become since. But you've asked me a question in front of the whole town, and a man can't build an honest life on a lie told at the altar, even one told through silence. So there it is. I'm the son of a man your husband's business partners may well have had a hand in destroying, and I understand entirely if that changes your answer to a question I never expected any woman, let alone one such as yourself, to ask me." The silence that followed this confession was different from the one before it. Heavier, charged with the particular tension of a town watching two people's pride and history collide in the open street. Isabel Cross stood very still, her hands, which had been clasped so composedly a moment before, now pressed together more tightly, her knuckles whitening beneath her gloves. Whatever she felt in that moment, she did not let the crowd read it easily on her face, though those closest to her would later swear they saw her jaw tremble, just slightly before she spoke. "My husband," she said slowly, "was a complicated man, Mr. Weatherby, and I will not stand here and pretend I do not know the shape of what you're describing, nor pretend that I have not, in the 2 years since his death, learned things about the manner in which his fortune was assembled that gave me many sleepless nights and no small measure of shame. I did not marry him for love, if I am to be as honest with this town as you have just been. I married him because my family's finances required it, and I spent 8 years learning to live inside that arrangement as best I could. And when he died, I inherited not only his wealth but the weight of knowing some portion of it was built on the ruin of other families' fortunes and, it seems now, other families' blood." She paused, and the crowd, transfixed, did not so much as shift their weight for fear of breaking whatever fragile thing was unfolding in the street before them. "If what you are telling me is true," Isabel continued, "then perhaps it is not scandal that stands between us in this moment, Mr. Weatherby, but reckoning. Perhaps the son of the man my husband's partners wronged, standing here asking whether I can still want him knowing his name, is not a shock this town ought to gossip over, but a mercy neither of us thought we'd be offered. I did not ask you to be my husband because I required a name free of complication. I asked because I have watched you with my son, and with the animals in that livery, and with the quiet dignity of a man who has clearly survived something that would have hardened most people into cruelty, and instead it made you gentle. That is a rarer thing than a clean name, sir, and it is the thing I find myself unable to walk away from, whatever the history behind it. Jack, or Jonathan, as the town would slowly come to know him again over the following months, stood with his hat still pressed to his chest, and something in his weathered face broke open in a way that had nothing to do with shame and everything to do with a relief so profound it nearly buckled his knees. "You'd take that risk," he said. "Knowing what this town will say, knowing some of your husband's old business partners might not take kindly to the son of Elias Weatherby standing at your side? I have buried a husband, built an empire, and raised a son largely alone in a territory that does not forgive women for wanting more than survival," Isabel said, and for the first time that afternoon, the steel in her voice softened into something warmer, something that made several of the watching women press their hands to their hearts. "I imagine I can survive a bit of gossip over a name, Mr. Weatherby, if the man wearing it is worth the trouble. So I will ask you once more, in front of this whole town, since you have seen fit to make our business theirs, will you be my husband?" The answer that came was not spoken so much as it was simply understood in the way Jonathan Weatherby crossed the remaining distance between them in 3 long strides, closing the gap that pride and secrecy had held between them for 3 months, and took her offered hand in both of his, bowing his head over it with a reverence that silenced even the most incorrigible gossips among the crowd. "I will," he said, "and I'll spend whatever years you'll grant me proving you were right to ask, in front of God and this whole territory, without a single secret left standing between us." The crowd that had gathered on Main Street that afternoon, expecting scandal or spectacle, or at the very least fodder for a month's worth of saloon conversation, found themselves instead witnessing something that quieted even the harshest tongues among them. Not the shocking unmasking of a hidden villain, as some had no doubt hoped, but the quiet, hard-won reckoning of 2 people who had each carried burdens heavy enough to break lesser souls, choosing, in the full light of day, to carry them together instead. Young Thomas, who had slipped through the crowd to stand near his mother during the whole exchange, ran forward now and threw his arms around Jonathan's waist with the uncomplicated joy of a child who had simply been waiting for the adults around him to catch up to what he'd known for weeks, that the quiet man from the livery belonged with them. In the months that followed, Redemption Creek did talk, as towns always do, and there were those who muttered about the wisdom of the wealthy widow tying herself to the son of a man once branded a troublemaker, but there were far more who found themselves, against their own expectations, rooting for the match, moved by the sight of Isabel Cross's carriage rides growing shorter as she chose instead to walk the dusty streets on her husband's arm, moved by the sound of Thomas's laughter ringing louder and more often from the Cross Ranch than it had in the 2 long years since his father's death. Jonathan Weatherby took up his true name again with quiet dignity, and used a portion of his new wife's considerable resources not to erase his father's memory but to finally clear it, hiring investigators who uncovered documents proving what many had long suspected, that Elias Weatherby had been the victim of a conspiracy among railroad interests rather than the villain the newspapers had painted him as. A truth that restored not only his son's name but a measure of peace to a grief Jonathan had carried silently for years. By the following spring, when Isabel and Jonathan stood before the small church at the edge of town to formally exchange vows in front of a congregation far larger and far warmer than the wary crowd that had gathered that July afternoon in the street, there was no shock left in Redemption Creek, no scandal left to whisper about, only the settled, satisfied understanding of a town that had watched 2 wounded people find in each other not a solution to loneliness, but a partner sturdy enough to carry the weight of truth without flinching from it. Isabel wore green that day instead of red, a color she said reminded her of new growth rather than old blood, and Thomas stood between them at the altar, holding both their hands, the living proof that sometimes the boldest, most shocking move a person can make in the wild reaches of an unforgiving territory is not a gunfight or a scandal, but simply the courage to tell the truth, and the greater courage still to love someone fully in the wake of it.